Hello again. Here I am. And no, it's not the same day. Actually, it totally is. And I'm going to be introducing Module 4. So building on Module 2 and 3, in this module, you're actually introduced to a very different approach to the study of race and racism. David Theo Goldberg introduces the three main elements of a racist discourse in the West that originate in the colonial encounter. There are several key points to retain from this week's material. Number one, in his attempt to account for contemporary forms of inequality, that means today's forms of racial inequality, Goldberg looks to the past. His periodization of race and racism differs from Miles and Omi and Winantz, in that he traces the genealogy of contemporary racism to the European imperial project, or specifically to Columbus's landfall in present-day Cuba at the end of the 15th century. By doing so, Goldberg ties his theorization to long-standing elements of European racism and colonialism. And this is the second point I'd like to make. He identifies three elements that we find at the basis of his understanding of what he calls and develops racist culture. These three elements are the primitive, the underclass, and the third world. These are what we call tropes. That is, words or expressions used as a figure of speech. And we'll focus on these three tropes during this week, and they're very useful tropes to think through in terms of your analysis for your work in this course. So one of the things that we'll be developing this week and through the course is an ability to identify these particular tropes and how they communicate racial meanings that have a long history in Western culture. The primitive is very much connected to European notions of progress, development, and of Western supremacy. It has a time-based logic that places all non-European peoples as outside the present, sort of like in some sort of frozen past. It is based on Darwinist logics that take Europeans as the ultimate incarnation of human biological, social, and political development. So very much based on an evolutionary model, a social evolutionary model, that places Europeans as the most developed. Now be on the lookout for this trope in current popular representations of indigenous peoples, for example, because it's often in those representations in Canada where we can see this notion of primitive being used to articulate particular forms of racism, or what Goldberg calls a racist culture, to those who consume those representations. The underclass is especially linked to notions of urban decay and poverty in today's society. Terms like the slum and ghetto most often carry a racialized dimension to go along with a deep social animosity for those living in poverty. What spaces in Halifax are imagined as containing an underclass that is almost entirely racialized. When I arrived in Halifax, without really knowing the city, having taught perhaps 2 months, I already knew from the comments and discussions that we had in the courses that I was teaching what areas of the city were seen as containing the underclass, were seen very much as the poor, dangerous, racialized areas that most students at St. Mary's would not dare go near. So there are several well-known urban neighborhoods whose residents are seen as naturally belonging there in Halifax. So this idea of the underclass gets articulated in ways that we just take for granted. Common sense, don't go there, don't go there. Don't go on this street, and don't talk to those people, for instance. And I have gone on all those streets and I've spoken with many, many of those people, and I've never encountered a problem. The third world builds on both the time and space-based understandings of the previous two tropes. In the first place, it refers to broad geographical regions that are where the large majority of racialized peoples currently inhabit. In the second place, it refers to the underdevelopment and impoverishment of the peoples of these regions. Taken together, the trope of the third world maintains the image of current racialized global inequalities as being natural predilections tied to particular forms of intelligence and or biological integrity. So the idea of the third world smuggles in this idea of race without ever saying anything explicit about race, and doesn't get us, for instance, here in Canada, to challenge the role that European colonialism and imperialism have played to impoverish those particular regions and peoples. All right. See you again next week.